Welcome. I'm Tamara Keyes, and today I'm going to discuss some commonly held misconceptions about gifted children and gifted education. While gifted education is not a new field, it is still a relatively unfamiliar area of education for many teachers, and as such, long-held beliefs or traditional ideas may be preventing students from gaining support they need to reach their full potential. My goal in this presentation is to provide information so we as teachers or parents or anyone, really, who is in contact with gifted children can discuss and contribute to gifted education from a point of knowledge rather than generalizations and false truths. This presentation will revolve around the quote by George Orwell that myths that are believed in tend to come true. This suggests that ideas, concepts, or attitudes held tend to become practice in the classroom and in the educational and teaching communities. The three myths that I feel are easy prey to this quote are gifted students are a homogenous group, gifted children will succeed on their own, and gifted children have social and emotional issues. These myths are particularly important to clarify if we are to appropriately identify and support gifted students in their educational journey. These three myths, if held as truth and put into practice, can have implications for identification, education, and the social and emotional development of gifted populations. Before proceeding, I'd just like to say when I refer to giftedness or gifts and talents, it's in relation to the current definitions used to guide gifted education policies and practices in New South Wales. These policies have adopted Gardner's definition of gifts and talents, gifts being potential or ability, and talents being performance or achievement. So we'll look at these myths, how they may have originated, developed and persisted over time, and what the research tells us. What are the facts to support or counter these myths? The view that gifted students are or are not a homogenous group is central to gifted education. It is, in my mind, the most important underpinning perception, as it lays the foundation for how we as teachers identify and support gifted students. If we believe they are a homogenous group, then we will try to identify them and support them in the same way. If we believe they are the same, this will be reflected in our ongoing practice. So where did this myth come from? It seems likely that this idea stems from traditional views of giftedness where, for over 100 years, the works of psychologist Lewis Terman have persisted. Terman's intelligence theory correlated high IQ scores with giftedness, and despite the emergence of more multidimensional conceptualizations of giftedness in more recent years, this myth continues to be widely accepted. The reasons for this, according to research by Brighton, Moon, Jarvis and Hockett in 2007, is that a vast majority of teachers still hold traditional views towards gifted learners. Teachers within this research were comfortable with gifted characteristics being linked to what Joseph Renzulli calls schoolhouse giftedness or lesson learning giftedness, but had difficulty conceptualizing non-typical characteristics to be associated with giftedness, such as displays of frustration, impatience, or a disconnect from the teachers or peers, which are also characteristics connected to the ability to learn more quickly and easily than their peers. So what does the literature tell us about this myth? In the last 30 years, literature states quite emphatically that gifted and talented learners are not a homogenous group. Research shows that giftedness is multidimensional. High IQ scores are no longer the sole identifier for high intelligence or ability. Many psychologists and researchers have identified a variety of definitions and models of giftedness, such as Gardner's multiple intelligences theory, Sternberg's theory of successful intelligence, Renzulli's three-ring conception of giftedness, and Gardner's differentiated model of gifts and talents. And while some of these constructs are overlapping or even competing, they share the common thread that intelligence is multifaceted. Literature and research also reflects that gifted students come from a diverse gifted populations and present with diverse characteristics, as shown in the brief overview of gifted learners. The first group, gifted, refers to the greater cohort and generally reflects the national, not necessarily the local norms. These students are generally easy to identify as they present with more typical characteristics, such as being studious, independent, articulate, and they acquire concepts at a faster rate than their peers. Characteristics teachers are generally more familiar with. The manifestation of gifts in these students may be in part responsible for perpetuating the perception that gifted students are a homogenous group. However, equally gifted yet often underrepresented within gifted education are gifted learners with disability, also referred to as twice exceptional students. These students have above average ability in one or more domains, but also have a presenting disability, which may mask their ability. Gifted underachievers are students who are gifted but for diverse reasons are failing to achieve within their area of giftedness. And there's also gifted minorities, who are students from diverse ethnic and linguistic backgrounds, as well as students from economically disadvantaged homes. These last three groups of students present both typically and atypically. They may be quick learners of new concepts but may fail standardised tests, for instance, and this can make these groups challenging to identify or even invisible to teachers. To further highlight the asynchronous development of gifted learners is Niehart and Bett's revised profiles of gifted learners. Perhaps the most comprehensive representation of gifted learners, which reflects the diverse nature and presenting characteristics of these gifted learners and populations. This model is widely adopted in Australia to guide gifted education and the identification of gifted children. Niehart and Betts identified 6 types of gifted learners, and as you can see, the presenting characteristics for each type of learner is quite different from the next, where the autonomous learner presents quite typically in both attitudes and behaviours, being socially adjusted, independent, resilient and motivated. The underground will go out of their way to hide their abilities, such as intentionally failing tests or not completing work, and can appear disconnected from the class or teacher. So what does this all mean for the gifted learner? The implications this myth has on gifted children can have profound, long-lasting effect. If the belief that gifted students are a homogenous group is believed in and becomes practiced within the school setting, then a great number of deserving gifted learners will be excluded from gifted programs, not just those that are gifted in other domains, but also those that present non-typically, especially gifted underachievers, gifted minorities, and twice exceptional students. And research supports this. Gifted education is guided by the implicit or explicit theory of giftedness about what makes someone gifted, and this theory or definition will guide who is included and excluded from gifted instruction. Research also suggests that a failure to identify and develop gifts is linked to subsequent negative, cognitive, academic, social, and affective development, resulting largely in underachievement and negative attitudes towards school, which are both linked to gifted learners dropping out of school. Renzulli and Park's research supports this and showed that a majority of high school dropouts were from the underrepresented populations. A bit of food for thought before we move on. Psychologist Joseph Renzulli draws attention to giftedness beyond high Q scores by stating that history tells us it has been the creative and productive people of the world, the producers rather than consumers of knowledge, the reconstructionists of thought in all areas of human endeavour, who have become recognised as truly gifted individuals. History does not remember persons who merely scored well on IQ tests. This next myth again reinforces why the initial quote that myths believed in tend to come true can so severely impact gifted learners and gifted education. The myth that gifted children will succeed on their own is, after all, an easy generalisation to make, and in turn to make the truth and subsequently be reflected in your practice. Many teachers do not consider gifted children to have exceptionalities in need of the same attention that children on the opposite end of the scale require. Maraka Gross suggested that this myth stems from the catch cry of the cream will rise to the top and is perpetuated from the assumption that all students of high ability will succeed, and that therefore those who do succeed represent the full quota of those who have potential. Gross stated that, like most simplistic arguments, it is extremely seductive. This belief may also be unwittingly perpetuated by limitations of funds and resources provided to teachers and schools to support students with additional needs. If pressed to make a decision with limited funds or resources, it's reasonable for many educators to decide to spend the money on helping a child catch up rather than focus on accelerating students beyond their grade level. From this perspective, it might not be a case of consciously accepting that gifted students will succeed on their own, rather a force of hand directing attention away from gifted learners towards students they feel are at greater risk if unsupported. This simple and seductive myth is contradicted by many studies and models of giftedness. Literature and longitudinal studies suggest that gifted education programs and curriculum increase students' achievement, creativity, productivity, aspirations, goals and motivation, and has positive social and emotional gains, both in the short and long term. Additionally, Garnet's model of talent development, which is widely accepted within Australian gifted and talented policies, stresses that for students to reach their full potential, gifts need to be developed in order to become talents. Garnet's differentiated model of giftedness and talent clearly identifies the need for appropriate provisions of activities, progress, and investments in order for the students to achieve or perform. It would be great to be able to say that gifted children will succeed and reach their full potential on their own, because sadly, gifted learners are still largely unidentified and uncatered for in schools. However, this is simply not the case. Gifted children have special learning needs, which if not met can lead to frustration, loss of self-esteem, boredom, laziness, underachievement, and lack of motivation, as well as social and emotional problems. Renzulli and Park's research points towards underachievement being a key factor associated with the student's lack of enjoyment and engagement with school and a curriculum, and can lead to gifted students dropping out in later years. Their research suggested that 5% of students that drop out of school are gifted learners, and this makes up a massive 18 to 25% of the gifted population. Just think about that. 18 to 25% of the gifted students potentially will drop out of school and not fulfill their abilities. Finally, Deisman and Washers argue that gifted students learn more rapidly than their non-gifted peers. Tasks that provide learning value for non-gifted students might only have practice value for gifted students, and when continually unchallenged, learning becomes easy, which in later life can create serious learning difficulties when gifted learners are confronted with more difficult material. Before we move on from this myth that gifted children will succeed on their own, have a think about this. Would you send a star athlete to train for the Olympics without a coach? The last myth is that gifted children have social and emotional issues. This myth, well, quite frankly, does hold some truth, and is potentially the myth out of the three we are discussing that falls prey most easily to idea that myths that are believed in tend to come true. We've all had that bright kid in class who excels academically or in other areas but just can't quite make friends, or who worries too much about getting things right, or who's so focused on their own interests to participate in other children's interests. We attribute these behaviours to their brightness and personality and provide scaffolding to try to be a better friend and for how to make friends. In fact, on a personal note, I've done this myself. My daughter struggled for years to make friends, so I brought her the making and keeping of friends. I'd organise play dates and watch her as she was disengaged with the activities her friends wanted to play. And then I wondered how such a smart child couldn't follow friend rules, and why she didn't enjoy playing with other people her own age and doing kid things. We attribute this struggle to their advanced abilities, and to some degree, it's easy to accept that it's just the way the bright kids are. I know I accepted this myth as explaining away my daughter's social and emotional behaviours, and held this myth to be true for a long time. Another possible reason for this myth's persistence is gifted children's presenting social and emotional behaviours. We may see a child who appears arrogant, or who gloats about their achievements, or who speaks rudely to adults. A gifted child may appear to be a stick in the mud to their friends or adults when adhering to and trying to enforce rules when other kids just want to move on. They may appear disengaged from peers and their activities, or have an unusually intense focus on certain things. But what we may not see is that this arrogance or gloating may just be an innocent acknowledgement or awareness of their own abilities and demonstration of their ability to learn more quickly and independently than their peers. And speaking rudely or challenging adults may in fact be a display of their advanced language and vocabulary skills, along with some difficulty communicating these advanced interests. Their adherence to rules may be a display of their advanced knowledge or understanding of rules and their high ability to make moral judgments. And disengagement with peers and activities may be the result of a lack of alignment with peers in interests and abilities. In fact, Gross frequently highlights that students' social and emotional age is more closely aligned with their mental age rather than their chronological age. So games that appeal to a regular 8-year-old, like playing house, may not appeal to a gifted 8-year-old who may rather read or play games that require more mental stimulation. And finally, an intense focus on certain things may simply be a display of high levels of motivation and task commitment to the area of interest. Research and literature suggests that there is no or inconclusive evidence to suggest that gifted learners are any more vulnerable to social and emotional problems than their age peers. Studies indicated an array of comparative strengths, vulnerabilities, and similarities between gifted and non-gifted learners. And Nehart's review of empirical literature suggests that gifted students have high self-concept and rate themselves higher on positive personality traits than did average ability students. This is also supported by Lewis Terman's longitudinal studies of 1,500 gifted individuals, which ran until 2010. He found that, in addition to being high academic achievers, these students were better adjusted as children and adults. Gross identified that social and emotional issues arise from a mismatch between the student and their environment, and as I mentioned earlier, is generally attributed to a failure to realise that gifted children differ from their age peers in their emotional and social development as much as they do in their intellectual and academic characteristics, which again is more highly correlated with their mental age than their chronological age. The main implications of this myth, and this brings me back to how we perceive gifted children's social and emotional characteristics, is the effect our perceptions of their behaviours has on how we treat them, and in believing that it's just the way they are, rather than acknowledge them as having the same social and emotional needs as any other child. Stereotyping a gifted child's social and emotional behaviours can have damaging results. Social and emotional needs need to be appropriately supported and developed by significant adults, just as they do for any child. But sadly, many characteristics are viewed as pathology rather than positive. As a result of accepting their social and emotional characteristics as simply a byproduct of their giftedness and not addressing their needs, gifted students may attempt to protect a positive image held of them as independent and capable individuals, and may not express their needs, believing them to be deviant or unusual. They may not learn to normalise troubling thoughts, feelings, and behaviours, and may develop an overarching view of themselves that there is something wrong with them, resulting in low self-concept. If unable to discuss and normalise and work through normal childhood social and emotional issues, children may be unprepared for the challenges related to leaving home, loss of high school identity, social transitions, different academic expectations, and new autonomy. A final food for thought. Social awkwardness is my superpower. Wouldn't it be sad if gifted learners feel this way and accept this as being just who they are, as this myth would suggest? So this brings us to the end of the presentation and suggests that myths that are believed in tend to come true. And it is seemingly accurate for these myths. And literature suggests negative and damaging implications related to the identification and educational services provided to gifted students, as well as the social and emotional development of gifted students if these myths continue. I hope I've been able to dispel these myths and shed some light on their origins and continuation, and provide facts surrounding each of them, but most importantly, the associated implications these myths have on both the gifted student and gifted education. And hopefully we can approach gifted students and gifted education with new perspectives. That gifted students are not a homogenous group. All gifted students will not succeed on their own, and gifted children have the same social and emotional issues as non-gifted children. Thank you.